Aguilar, one of these guys who, because he scored in week 2, there are going to be teams that go after him on waivers. And it's not to say that couldn't work out. But what I'm hearing you say, and definitely the way that I'm looking at this, even as a Nelson Aguilar fan, have a few shares at the end of best ball drafts, that you want to stick with some of these stashed wide receivers who project to be potential real impact players over the second half of the year, as opposed to pivoting to guys who scored well in week 2, but we have a long enough track record of them at the NFL level. And then within the context of their offenses, you're probably only going to end up kicking yourself later because you start them when they don't score. And maybe occasionally there are some big games, but overall it's a losing proposition to, number one, take up the roster spot. And then secondly, to actually plug them into your starting lineup in weeks where it doesn't make sense. You could have won if you had just kind of stood with your roster as it was.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same thing we talked about, I believe it was last week, with the running backs, where talked about the expected value equation. I feel like I'm talking about it too much lately, but the probability of something hitting versus the size of the payoff. We're not looking for guys who just have roles. We're not trying to project. I mean, like, so much of the fantasy content out there has then led people to think about fantasy football that way, that it's all about who has a role and who's like, I bet you this guy's going to score more points than that guy next week. And in most cases, when those are a discussion, I mean, it took me a couple of years of like having those discussions, be like, no, I think this guy's going to be better. And realizing like, I'm actually making a bad bet there, because more than 50% of the time, the veteran who has the bigger role is going to score more points. But they're not going to score a lot of points. It's going to be 12 points to 8 points or something with the young guy or whoever. But what we're looking for is the player that can actually be a huge impact, can break out in the way that Garrett Wilson did last week. And then especially when you're talking about on your bench, you're talking about like the way to play fantasy football on your bench. Like, people are way too concerned about insurance. They're way too concerned about, well, what happens next week if I have an issue and I need to play somebody? And it does suck when you get to that week and you don't have anyone to plug in and it's hard to find someone on the wire. But like, that's a worst case scenario where you have some injuries and things go bad. And even then you can probably find somebody on the wire that's not much different than what Nelson Aguilar is in terms of a range of potential outcomes. Aguilar, like you said, still has the potential to have some 5-point games, maybe even right away next week. And some other guy you grab off the waiver wire, has that same kind of concern, right? And I have some leagues where I have so many of these stash sort of upside plays into the future that I don't feel like I have enough depth to plug in players. But you do want a lot of the players on your bench to be players that maybe aren't even producing right now. I mean, that sounds weird. I'm not saying you necessarily want that, but ideally every player in your team is scoring a bunch of points. But in terms of your actual allocation, you're trying to look for the size of the hit in the future. And so if a decent number of the players on your bench are those types of players, it's not the worst case scenario. It's a scenario where your bench hasn't gone absolutely crazy and you don't have as much depth as maybe some of the teams we talked about at the top of the show. And we're talking about how we still have, Jahan Dotson on the bench on some of these teams and things, and Dotson's playing well. Like, that's the best case scenario, to have a guy who's actually scoring on your bench. Like, that's good. But if you don't have these guys that are hitting on your bench, what you do want on your bench is guys that can score at some point in the future in a way that is meaningful and impactful. And so with a guy like Sky Moore, what we're talking about is a scenario where once he works into a role, which happens with a lot of rookies, takes time. We've talked about this a ton. Saw it with Amon-Ra St. Brown last year. Saw it in A.J. Brown's rookie year. I'm not saying Sky Moore's guaranteed to be those types of players, but this is an offense that produces fantasy points and the receivers are not looking very good. And so in that scenario, when Sky Moore does start to play more, run more routes, play more snaps, be out there a lot more, we're talking about a guy who's probably a consistent startable player every single week.
And making sure you have enough of those types of guys helps you as the season moves along. I think that sometimes it's too easy to look at injuries and think, well, I didn't win because I got unlucky, because I drafted this player in round 4 and round 5 and round 6 and they got hurt. And teams who do that and have their players get hurt don't win, as opposed to looking at it as you didn't continue to load up on the types of players who can help you get across, number one, those injuries, number two, the bye weeks. The other important element of it is that you not only need to have those players on your bench, but you need to block your league mates from having those players on their bench as the season goes along. So when you drop those players and bring in guys who don't really make sense for a league champion type of team, then not only have you weakened your team, but you've made another team in your league stronger. And that's one of the things that we're looking at as we go through waivers over this first month. It's not just going in to see who was picked up this week. It was to see who was dropped, who was in a situation where their team, where either they weren't patient enough or the short-term need got to be so great that they had to give up on somebody who was very, very interesting, and then go in and bid the next week, not on the number one player from that week, but simply the high upside option who was dropped the previous week because someone couldn't keep stashing them. That part of it can be overlooked, but it's just as important that you can't let your league mates have those players on their rosters.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It's a great point. Treylon Burks is another guy that might be viewed like that right now. But I want to make a case right now that his week 3 could look like Garrett Wilson's week 2, because I think what will get missed by anyone who's looking at the full game numbers is that his role rose substantially. I think anyone who watched the game knows that he started. He got a target on the first play. He caught like a 15-yard pass or something. He caught a 3rd and 16 crosser and turned upfield to get to the sticks, get the first down, showed some after the catch explosiveness.
And he looked like he was billed as a prospect, and he looked the way he looked at Arkansas before there was all of this summer talk about the conditioning and the asthma.
Yeah.
He looked like someone who shouldn't be that athletic for the size. I mean, it's striking when he has the ball in his hands that someone of that size moves with that much agility and then the ability to turn up and be explosive.
Yeah, he looked really good, frankly. The Titans looked terrible as a team. Burks only winds up with 4 catches for 47 yards on 6 targets, which also masks that this should have been viewed, I think, as a very positive game for Treylon Burks. I think everything through 2 weeks should be viewed as a positive for Burks, other than the fact that the Titans as a team look terrible. That's a pretty important fact. Let me say. But in week 1, I noted that both Robert Woods and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine ran a bunch of routes and only got 2 targets and didn't really look that great. In week 2, we saw it again. They ran a bunch of routes and they weren't very effective. Robert Woods does catch 4 balls, but only for 39 yards. Some of them are like sort of on outlet plays. He's basically, the check down running back on at least one of the plays. Burks was the, alpha, as people like to say. He was the vertical X receiver running these downfield routes and looking like A.J. Brown looked in this offense. It was very clear. The Titans got blown out so bad, and then Ryan Tannehill threw the pick 6 that it really got bad late in the third that they went to Malik Willis with a few minutes left in the third quarter. The Bills followed suit. Both teams played their backups for more than a quarter, or by the end of the third. And so you wind up with numbers where Burks' snap share didn't really rise that much. His route share didn't really rise that much. Just in snaps that Ryan Tannehill played, his route share rose in terms of percentage of dropbacks up to 73%, which is a huge number for week 2 for him. It's a big boost from the 38% in week 1. It looked like he might be a guy we might need to wait and see on, but he almost doubles from week 1 to week 2, the percentage of his dropbacks that he's running routes on. Like I said, he made some plays. And then the other important part that I think here that has gone so well for him, other than just the other receivers not looking good in a way that has made it very clear they need to use Burks more, and they've already responded to that. And then Burks looked like that. Other than just the receiver element, is that Derrick Henry has looked so bad. And I think part of that is they don't have A.J. Brown anymore. They don't have a vertical passing game that's threatening defenses. And that is something that matters in this offense. They need to be able to threaten teams with the play action and the vertical element. I don't think Mike Vrabel's a stupid coach. I think he understands that we need to get Treylon Burks going not just because he looks like our best weapon in the receiving game and our most explosive player as a receiver, but because to run the ball, we have to have a threat down the field. And so I think that's another element where, I mean, they're going to keep giving the ball to Derrick Henry as much as they have to, but they need to do things to open up the running game because they can't just keep running Henry into loaded boxes. And again, that has to be Treylon Burks. There's like no answer to this question, is there, for the Titans, other than getting Treylon Burks going to jumpstart every level of their offense, their passing game, their running game, everything. And that's what we talked about in the offseason. That was part of, even though there was all this negative stuff on Burks, part of the idea was they don't have anything else in terms of what can threaten defenses in the passing game to keep Burks off the field. I think we just saw it in week 2, but the Titans were so bad that it didn't show up on his stat sheet. It didn't show up in his routes. I don't know that he's going to have 30-point games like Garrett Wilson just did in this offense, but I do think Treylon Burks having a 20-point game in week 3 is not hard to see.
And even though the Titans have been bad, I think the thing you have to be very mildly optimistic about is that Ryan Tannehill is still in a lot different situation than, say, Matt Ryan. And Tannehill's numbers with the Titans have been fantastic, in part because he's throwing against these boxes that are set to stop Derrick Henry. And Henry is still there. And in all likelihood is still pretty close to what he was. So if you do get the passing element going a little bit, this offense could turn around. You mentioned the complete lack of other weapons. I don't think in the wide receiver room that's a huge surprise. I'm sure that the Titans are a little bit disappointed that Austin Hooper looks like he looked with the Cleveland Browns, which is someone who essentially can't make any impact on an offense. And so it has to be Burks. The fact that Woods has had so little impact through 2 games, where we mentioned from time to time that there are these very context-specific types of fantasy plays that do work sometimes. So if your thesis for Robert Woods is that, he's an okay veteran player and the Titans have nothing, and Treylon Burks had a poor offseason, and so Woods is going to have to be a volume play, you could understand that thesis, and it wouldn't have been a shock if it had played out. But it's also not the play that we like to make for the reasons that we articulate pretty consistently. And in this case, it's not playing out. And so that opens up to Burks to be number 1, the talent guy, and then number 2, also the person that the volume has to flow through. I think this offense with Henry and Burks can be fun. And I think that you have to get those offers out to acquire Burks in almost every format. This is probably your last chance. And I think the people who drafted Burks in the first place, many of them had him ranked really high. You think about Dynasty. Burks was the Debbie guy in this class for a long time. And Debbie players tend to be very good with player evaluation, and they tend to be able to withstand some of the short-term stuff that maybe redraft managers, are not as soaked in the backgrounds of these prospects, and maybe you're going to come off of them pretty quickly. If you've had Burks for multiple years as a college guy, you saw what he did last year. You're not going to come off of him because he has some conditioning issues in camp and the Titans will look bad in 2 games. But in some more straightforward Dynasty formats, if you drafted at a time period where Burks is still going ahead of Wilson and you're frustrated by that, maybe you can get Burks for a DJ Moore, and maybe you should. So that'd be an interesting question to ask you. Obviously, DJ Moore, one of your favorites. I'm making the case in a Dynasty wide receiver rankings piece that should be out by the time people are listening to the show, that some of the biggest risk wide receivers in Dynasty are guys who actually do have very high talent levels, but have some uncertainty at the QB position that will extend out, not just now, but probably for multiple years. And that a misunderstanding of what you might consider the peak for players, combined with a misunderstanding of the way trade values move, have players in this DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, Deontay Johnson, even though we do have some optimism for him, players in that age range, talent range, and quarterback situation are maybe still a little bit overvalued in Dynasty. Now, it doesn't mean that you can buy as much for DJ Moore now as you could 2 weeks ago. Now that people have seen Baker Mayfield play with the Carolina Panthers, what's your level of concern for some of those guys? And I always think it's interesting to ask people where they are on two players they obviously like and what they would be looking to do in that situation.
Well, I refuse to say anything negative about DJ Moore, and you're wrong. So let's just move on. Yeah, I kind of said that in Stealing Signals this week, that I could see him being a sell, even like a little bit of a sell low, but I would never actually recommend that because I'm hopelessly in the tank for DJ Moore. That was the most depressing thing that you've said to me in a while there, Shawn, because you're right. And you talked to me a little bit about this concept before we started recording. I didn't realize you were going to drop DJ Moore on me, or on me as a poster boy for the concept. But the guy that I told you or gave you back as a good example that I thought of, for the point you're trying to make, I think, is Allen Robinson, who for years we stayed very optimistic about because he hadn't played with a good quarterback yet, and essentially just missed the window. And now we're all saying it's just really kind of sad that Allen Robinson in his prime never played with a good quarterback. But even late in his Jaguars years, and then when he goes to the Bears and has a good Bears season, there's a lot of points where his dynasty value was still very high because he's still young enough and he's still got his peak ahead of him and all of those things. And yet, if you go back to those points in his career and you ask the people who acquired him at those points whether they are comfortable with that decision, given the way his career played out, I think most of them would say, given what they probably paid, that they were not, that he didn't do a lot to help them win championships in those years, and whatever future picks they paid and all those things panned out pretty negatively for them, in the sense that they could have used those picks or used the potential players, young players, new assets and opportunities in Dynasty that could have been available to them. And so what your point is with DJ Moore and DK Metcalf and Deontay Johnson is if they're not in a great situation right now, and we're kind of saying, well, the DJ Moore year's coming, which is kind of the point that I've kept saying. What you're sort of saying is the DJ Moore season may never come, the year where everything is actually right for him, or if it does come, then it might be too late from a talent perspective for him. It is really great that we got to see for Stephon Diggs, him go to the Bills and be in this great situation and have that monster year, but that possibly that is sort of more the exception to the rule, and we're not really understanding that more and more bad seasons with these bad quarterbacks and bad offenses are just going to eventually cause people to lose interest. Obviously, DJ Moore's done this for a couple of years, and he's still stayed pretty valuable, but not trading him now runs the risk of him having another pretty bad year that doesn't help you in the short term, and also sees his value continue to fall as he continues to age. I think that's a really astute point. And yet, it can't be applied to DJ Moore.
Just
he's too good, Shawn.
He's too good.
He's gonna have that year. That year's coming, and you're gonna be like, well, yeah, I mean, I should have bought into DJ Moore. No, I mean, you're right.
Maybe
what we need for the DJ Moore year to happen, and it needs to happen in the next couple of years probably, or else you're starting to talk about his late 20s. So we need Matt Rule to get fired. We need them to draft a new quarterback. We need that quarterback to be good. We need a system that's good. And then, finally we'll see positives. There's a lot of things that are bad here, not just one, that his situation sucks. It's a lot of elements of his situation suck that all need to be fixed, or he may never have that big production. He may have the Allen Robinson thing.
Is it out of the question for Baker Mayfield and the Panthers to go to their opponents before the game start and be like, could you guys crouch down when I'm getting ready to throw it?
Because Mayfield gets so many passes batted at the line. Yeah. It would be helpful if they could do that. I mean, maybe they can pay him off. I don't know. We just need to get a few passes to DJ Moore. His week 2, very disheartening. Part of the reason I wrote about the sell thing was that they threw a wide receiver screen to Robbie Anderson. They threw a wide receiver screen to Shi Smith. They're not even getting those touches into DJ Moore's hands, which is just went terribly for the team. Shi Smith got 2 yards. Robbie Anderson fumbled. Like, those are not yak players. DJ Moore is.
Do you assume that the theory there is that you got to manufacture touches for those guys because they can't really get open?
Well, the fun thing
you're
is
sort of assuming that DJ Moore is going to get his 10 targets, but this goes back to my point about McCaffrey's usage in week 1. Scheme targets and touches to peripheral players after you've already gotten your main guys at least the number of touches that they can handle in the first half.
Don't even scheme targets and touches to your peripheral players. Look at what Miami did. Like, they just threw the ball to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle every single
you're
time.
allowed to do that?
That no one else on their team caught more than 4 passes, and they had like 450 passing yards. I think Mike Gesicki's 4 for 41 line was their 3rd best receiving line on the team in a game where they had 450 passing yards.
Well,
I mean, that's the most insane thing. They only had 2 more guys catch more than 2 passes. One of them was Raheem Mostert. It was Gesicki and Mostert. I mean, the 3 more guys have more than 10 yards. They had Alec Ingold. Their fullback had 15 yards. Mostert had 28. Gesicki had 41. And then Waddle had 171 and Tyreek had 190. And they combined for 32 targets and 22 catches. Just do that. Why are you not doing that, Carolina? What are you doing?
Mike Gesicki begs to differ and would like some more targets. On his touchdown, I think he put up a 50-inch vertical.
That was a great play.
I mean, have you seen a tight end levitate?
We don't need to do a Mike Gesicki thing now. You already did a Nelson Aguilar thing. We're talking.